Went and got a haircut this morning, and the people at the haircut place, the lady noticed my clerical right away, and we had a nice conversation about, you know, being a pastor and wearing a uniform, so to speak. Um, I've always thought that the off chance of someone seeing the clerical collar and approaching me and asking for prayers or a blessing was worth it. Um, and I feel like people should know who I am and what I do all the time, right? That you never know what kind of situation somebody might be in, the emergency that they might have. If I'm wearing typical stuff, how are they going to know, right? That's always been my reason for wearing a clerical collar. I just want people to know what I do so they can approach me and if they need prayers, receive them, or any other counsel. So it was an interesting conversation. It happens a lot to me. I'd say it probably happens once a week. Somebody points out the clerical and asks them about a pastor or just comments on it. And it's almost always positive. And, it's a funny thing. I see a lot of people who talk about, oh, well, I don't want to wear a clerical because it creates division or it creates distance between me and my people. It's like, I have never, in 15 years of ministry, never had a negative reaction to a clerical, ever. Never had anybody come up to me and say something mean or rude or be angry about it. Not once. So I just don't buy it. My evidence would suggest that that is just a load of malarkey. It's better to wear it than not to wear it. I think honestly, some people wear it because they don't want to, because it makes them look not cool or not hip, and you can't be that hip youth pastor if you're wearing a clerical. Maybe, I don't know. I'm an old crotchety man though, so what do I know? So we are in Proverbs today, Proverbs 15, and we have a bevy. I'm gonna do 5 Proverbs today, and they're all kind of fun. They're all like fairly disparate in terms of their connections to one another, so they're kind of just standalone, but they're fun. They're interesting ideas for us to consider. By the way, this very, if I haven't said it already, I think I have it once before. It's a very common way for Jewish people to teach. The rabbis would teach through questions. They would ask their people questions, their school, and they would answer those questions, and they'd kind of build lectures and whole lessons just from questions. It's very common to ask questions. Yeah, I think it's very common for the Pharisees and the scribes to go up to Jesus and ask questions. It's common for him to be asked questions by his own disciples, and it's common for him to answer questions. And then Jesus is asking tons of questions himself. Who do the people say that I am? Or, I try to go another place Jesus asks his disciples a question. Well, after the parable of the sower, he asked them, do you understand these things? Do you know? Or do you know what they mean? That's a question. Not exactly the same kind of thing, but I believe, let's see here. He asked the question about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Which one of these went away? And then the Good Samaritan too. Which one of these men was the man's neighbor? And then they say, well, the Samaritan, right? So it's pretty common to ask questions to kind of throw out. In other words, it seems like Jews don't learn. Rabbis teach and their schools learn, and it seems like they primarily do it through discussion, right? Like they put something out there kind of in the middle of or a question, and then they say, now let's talk about it, right? Let's discuss. And that's definitely today, right? Lots of interesting ideas to be discussed. So let's jump right in. Yivelet simha lahasar lev va'is tebuna yayaser laket. Now we have Ivelet, which is folly. And earlier in the book of Proverbs, we talked about this, that wisdom and folly are both personified. Wisdom is a woman who is calling men into her in a very good way. She wants them to come and listen and to learn and to grow. And then folly is the woman of ill repute who's calling men into their doom and calling men into their downfall and she's a trap, right? So there's two ideas. So I think in verse 21, I think we're thinking of folly as like a personified concept, like it's something, right? That's ridiculous. Something that means nothing. Um, the proverb writer is referring to folly as a like a category, but probably better said, like almost a personified force. I mean, honestly, I think at the roots of folly is the devil, right? Like he's encouraging people to do dumb things, sinful things, wrong things. So I mean, really, folly is just a fancy word for the machinations or the work of the evil one, yeah, of the devil. Okay, so folly, right? Folly, like something like folly takes joy, or or it is the joy of folly, something like that. Folly's joy is him who lacks discernment, right? Folly's joy is him who lacks discernment, and we would say him here too because it is masculine, so that's why I would say him as opposed to her or them or it, right? So I think it is the again we go back to like when David's talking to Solomon, those early proverbs we worked through, and David's encouraging like, hey, go towards wisdom, go away from folly, and he does this whole section. He's teaching his son, right? So I think it's kind of going back to that idea, like a young man who lacks discernment. Well, that's the joy of folly, right? The folly takes joy in someone who lacks discernment. Let's see. Now I have my NIV study Bible open today as opposed to my ESV. I left it downstairs, so I didn't want to take time to go get it. So here we are. Folly delights a man who lacks judgment. Now, see, they don't put in a man because it's not technically in the scriptures. I can see why they would do that, but it sounds more natural in English to say something like folly delights in a man who lacks judgment. And in English, it'd be smoother. Lacks discernment. So let's see here. We've talked about simcha and we've talked about ivalet. Let's look at this word lave for discernment. That comes from. I thought that was it, but that didn't make any sense. So it is that lave is the word for heart. We've had that before too, but apparently it can also mean the inner man. It can be one's own mind, right? So we can understand why this would come to discernment, right? Or 21 goes judgment. I think that actually is maybe less correct than discernment because discernment kind of. So in other words, where do you sit and judge things or pick between the two? You think about it and then you'd be like, okay, well, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. You do that in your mind, or you could say also in your heart, right? And God, my tab keeps poking out. I don't know why it's doing that today. Um, so that makes sense that discernment like that would happen in the heart, right? So, but I wonder if okay. My guess is they went with discernment because the second part of the sentence goes, but a man of understanding, tebunah. Um, let's look up tebunah. Yeah, understanding, reasoning, discernment. So I think the reason why they because I mean one could make a case that he's saying like they just lack heart in general, right? And that could be fairly vague, right? I mean, it could be heart in terms of strength, resolve. It could be heart in terms of care and compassion. It could be heart in terms of just like strength of character, right? I mean, there's more. We can, so it's interesting it's interesting. There's lots of ways to go with that, but I think they go with discernment in the NIV because the second part of the sentence gives the opposite. It's like an antonym, so to speak. but a man of understanding walks uprightly, right? So we can see where we would take the lave to mean not just like hard, but probably like to be along those same lines as discernment, because of the second part of the sentence. I'm curious. I would like to see what the. I'm going to look it up on the online here real quick. The ESV. I just like to see what the ESV translates that as. Or maybe, you know what? Let's get nuts. Instead of the ESV, let's do something we haven't done before. A translation we haven't used before. Like the New King James sometimes is interesting. That's helpful. But I'm gonna do. I just want to do the NRSV, but they don't seem to have the normal one. They have like the. You have the NSRV Catholic edition, Anglican edition, and a NRSV updated edition. Ugh. New Revised Standard Version, anglicized. Let's try that. Okay. So we get into. What verse are we on again? 21. That's right. A folly is a joy to one who has no sense. Oh man, that's totally different. But a person of understanding walks straight ahead. See, I would disagree with that translation because the way that folly is used in the book of Proverbs, I think that is folly being personified, like as a concept. So let's go back to the good old ESV and see what they say. Okay, 21. Folly is a joy. ESV does that too. Folly is a joy to him who lacks no sense, but a man of understanding walks right ahead. Huh. And then NIV says folly delights. So this is saying basically the him who lacks no sense is this basically the subject, right? The main character, and it's saying that, in other words, that the man who lacks no sense takes joy in doing or acting out folly, like, or I mean, it doesn't make sense in English, but being folly, like doing it. But the NIV goes folly delights. So in other words, folly is the kind of the thing. So it's important, the difference, right? Nominative feminine singular, nominative feminine singular. Huh. So there's no direct object in the sentence. There's an adjective, a lacking one, or right. So it's lacking, and then it's got a masculine ending to it. So that's why I'd say like a lacking one or lacking man. So you have two nouns back to back, basically folly and joy, and they're both nominative feminine singular, which makes sense because that's how folly is described earlier in the book. So yeah, I don't understand why they go that route. Yeah, I like my translation. I'm gonna stick with it. Folly takes joy in him who lacks discernment. Maybe it is to reflect the nature of the second part of the sentence, but a man of understanding walks uprightly. So the subject of the second part of the sentence is the man who walks uprightly, right? But here, the subject is folly, or at least that's the translation is going for. So I guess I can see ESV wanting to make those two phrases balance between the around the vowels, for so to speak. So I guess that makes sense. A man who is lacking discernment, folly is his joy. but a man of understanding uprightly walks. And I think the folly is completely contrasted with uprightly, right? Like those are opposite kind of ideas or terms. Folly is something that isn't upright, doesn't do uprightness, this kind of things. Uprightness, of course, is the opposite of folly. Um, so a couple of thoughts. People who do bad things for their benefit. When I was in England, I had my passport stolen. I'm sure to that person, the passport was worth some money. You probably stole it. But what they didn't understand is how much, or maybe they did, but I like to think that they really had no idea how much damage they were doing to my life, how complicated they were going to make things. In other words, like this, they don't have any discernment as to how difficult what they do, their actions can make life. Rather, they just enjoy folly, the pursuit of folly, doing uh, whatever they can do to fulfill their pleasures, doing whatever they can do to um, serve the idols in their life, money, possessions, fame, whatever, right? So folly would be basically a pursuit of self, pursuit of selfish desires and needs. Um, and it almost always goes alongside a lack of wisdom, a lack of understanding, um, which makes sense, right? Because some of our most destructive desires, some of our desires are very destructive. If we had discernment as to what our desires did to people, we would probably not do them. But we go ahead and do them because we don't have any discernment that like this could be negative to other people. This could hurt them, right? So it's very selfish in nature, right? You're only considering your own needs as well. Um, uh, in a sense of like you're only interested in making yourself feel good and feel happy and feel pleasure. Uh, but a man of understanding uprightly walks. He. The Bible talks often about like living life is walking the path. I think the Shema talks about in Deuteronomy. Um, Love the Lord your God while you're walking on the road, while you're lying in the house. Like so, like walking along the road is part of life. And there's lots of times too where it talks about just walking a path is like a metaphor for spiritual life and following the Lord, right? Which in time of Jesus becomes very true. They literally do that a lot, and Jesus talks about it the same way. So walks, I think, would be maybe metaphorical for just how that person lives, how they operate their life, the things they do, the things they say. A man of understanding, lives a life of uprightness, for lack of a better way of saying it. Yeah. Okay. 22. Um, Haper Mahasabot Ba'ain Sod Uberob Yeoasim Takum. So we don't get a very clear subject here, or not subject, but maybe like referent. So let's see what the NIV is saying. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Okay, so we have here the first word is go awry, plans without counsel, but in the multitude of counselors they are established. So yeah, I think the they, because we have noun feminine plural here, and then we have noun imperfect third feminine singular. You'd think it would be plural though. Yeah, that's okay. I think that they are established. would refer back to plans, right? So in other words, like plans fail when you don't have counsel, but when you have multitude of counsel, right, they succeed, right? And this is, two heads are better than one, right? That's an English proverb. Um, and then teamwork is better in general, just kind of as an idea. Like, there's a lot of people who don't like teamwork, who don't work well in teams. I like to think that I do. I know I don't always. Sometimes I'm kind of a guy who, for good reason, you're in charge of stuff. You're ultimately judged on the things that you write, the things that you do. So you kind of want to be in control of it, right? But you also realize that there's no way you can do this thing on your own. It's too big. It's too complicated. And some of the most productive sermon writing times I've ever had is when I'm sitting down with fellow brothers and we just talk about the text and we're kind of going back and forth. And it really is, it's hard to explain, but for some reason, if we were doing this apart, just by ourselves, there wouldn't be a multiplication of force. But when we come together, suddenly I'm saying something and then he bounces back like, oh, what about like this? What you said makes me think about this. And I was like, oh man, what you said makes me think about this. And we're kind of like almost bouncing this ball back and forth and we're multiplying force. So teamwork, especially in like, I've always thought sermon study, so helpful. So helpful. I don't do it enough, not nearly enough. With the brothers in the Sioux Falls circuit, we don't do that all that much. We like get together for Winkle, but we very rarely do sermon study together because all the guys in the circuit are like doing their own thing in terms of sermon series and stuff like this, so that we're not all in the same lectionary system. We're not all using the same readings. It just isn't all that helpful. But when you get the opportunity to do it, it's really fun. Okay. Verse 23. Simcha la'is bema'aneh P-O, actually. Vedabar be'eto ma tov. So simcha is first, which is joy, right? And then we have la'ish, a man. So a man has joy by the answer of his P-O. It would be P is mouth, right? And then the O is the suffix would be the pronoun, right? So his mouth. P-O. So a man has joy, but I'm curious how the NIV smooth that out. A man finds joy in giving an apt reply. Answer of his mouth. Let's see what the ESV has. An apt. I'm confused where they're getting apt from. Yeah, the word mana, which our derivation here is bemana. I have to imagine that a man has joy, and we were not getting anything negative about him. So he's not a fool. He's just a man, right? And so it seems, in other words, like it doesn't seem like this is a negative statement about a man. Okay, so we'll start there. So a man, excuse me, a man has joy, and if he has joy, then there must be something worthwhile about the answer of his mouth. So I think that's where they're getting with this, an apt answer. And apt, let's look that up in English just so we're clear what apt means. We probably used it in sentences, but never actually defined it. appropriate or suitable in the circumstances. That's interesting, right? So a man takes joy when he gives an answer that is appropriate or suitable in the right time, right? So then we get a continuation. Probably apt comes from the continuation of the sentence, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is, right? Vedabar, a word, how good it is. Now, debar is almost, it's not always, but it's used very often, like when the Lord speaks or the Lord's words. So I feel like that's lurking in the background here, right? A good word, a word spoken, right, in due season. So, in other words, in maybe like real life, you're in a situation, someone's struggling, and you offer them God's word, right? Just a verse of scripture you've memorized, a reminder that they're loved by Christ, something to that effect, right? So a man has joy. Probably also a connection to maybe to 22, this idea of, but a multitude of counselors they're established. So maybe in the context of a multitude of counselors, right? A man takes joy, right? Because he gives a good answer to someone who's asking. And a word spoken in due season, how good it is. 24, Ora Hayim, Lemaskil, Lema'an, Sur, Mesa'ol, Mata. Something like for the wise, or the way of the way of life for the wise is upwards. What does the NIV say? Path of life leads upward for the wise. Yeah. That he may turn away from hell below. Well, that's interesting. I had, yeah, so it's Shaul. Well, actually, that's not that interesting. Now that I think about it. Shaul is pretty regularly described as being below the earth or under the earth. In Jonah's context, under the depths of the sea, right? So at the bottom of the ocean, right? But it's always down. Jesus picks up on that a little bit. Seems to be talking about a similar idea that hell is a place that is down. I suppose our creed really irons us out too. Descended into hell. That kind of idea. So in other words, Christ descended from somewhere. He wasn't in heaven, so he descended from this plane, Earth, to somewhere else. Hell. We know he descended to hell. We just don't know where it is. But it seems to be an idea of going down. Yeah. So why is the way of their life upward? Well, the wise, the roots of biblical wisdom in the Proverbs is a fear and knowledge of the Lord. So that if we're going to remember that wisdom is not like some kind of Platean or Aristotelian thought, but or Eastern wisdom or Confucius, whatever, right? It's not this, but rather wisdom is a fear and knowledge of the Lord. It is the Ten Commandments. It is the Pentateuch. It is the gospel, the gospel things that God does in Exodus. A knowledge of these things, and the fear, the love and compassion of the Lord, a fear and knowledge of all this. That's the root of wisdom. So it would make sense then that a wise person, right, a person who, so wisdom in this sense too is not necessarily something that's learned through human effort. But wisdom is something that's given by God. It's faith, for lack of a better word. And um, the person who stays in wisdom, who continues in wisdom, who is in wisdom, right? Well, they're naturally going to trend towards heaven, whereas someone else who denies wisdom, they trend in a different direction. Last verse, 25. Ba'et Ga'im Yisa Yahweh Veyaseb Gabul Almanah. The house of Ga'im, the proud, I will destroy. So Yahweh, something like Yahweh says, the house of the proud I will destroy. But actually, it should probably be better said like something like the house of the proud Yahweh will destroy, would be a better way to say it. But he will establish, because then it agrees with the pronoun later in the sentence, but he will establish the boundary of the widow. So the boundary would be the boundary lines of the widow's property. The house would be, so we're actually going in scope from smaller to larger. In other words, Christ will destroy not just the boundary lines of the proud, but even his own very house. Whereas the widow, someone who is at the bottom of the food chain, who is someone to be pitied, someone to be given grace and mercy to, because they don't have a lot of control of their lives, and their situation is bleak, right? Um, the poor in the spirit, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the kingdom, they shall inherit the earth. So the widow, blessed is the widow, for the Lord will establish her boundary. Kind of a new beatitude, so to speak. I think this happens both in life and at the end of time, right? The proud, the multimillionaire, those fortunes do not persist, not forever. Not for as long as God will, for any sakes, right? Like maybe they persist for a couple hundred years, perhaps, but they're not going to persist as long as God's treasures can. So like, in other words, in life, God does this stuff. He destroys the house of the proud. There's lots of examples of it. But also, the ultimate working out of this prophecy will be at the last day, right? Where it'll be very clear that putting your hope and your trust and your faith in your house, your possessions, your money, and princes, not a good idea, right? Rather, trust in the Lord to take care of you. So we have it there. 33 minutes. We worked through 5 Proverbs. Hope they were valuable to you today. Hope you enjoyed your time with me. Don't forget, at the end of the week, go to church, go to Bible study this week, go to catechism if you can, all kinds of fun stuff. Take time to learn from your pastor. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week. God's blessings to you all.